Welcome back to Faith Talks. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Mike. We're so glad you're here for part 2 of Pastor Kyewoon Choi's sermon series, How to Know God's Will.
Last time, we learned that knowing God's will isn't optional. It's essential for every believer. Pastor Choi reminded us that our eternal destiny depends on doing the will of God.
That's right. And today, we'll look at the obstacles, the things that can block us from really knowing God's will. The message is based on John 7:10-24, where Jesus teaches during the Feast of Tabernacles.
In that story, Jesus faces opposition from the religious leaders who can't recognize that his teaching comes from God. And Jesus says something powerful in verse 17. If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from myself.
That's the key. Willingness to do God's will opens the door to knowing God's will. But as Pastor Choi points out, there are 3 big obstacles that often stand in our way.
The first obstacle is what Pastor Choi calls insisting on staying in our comfort zones. The religious leaders refused to change. They didn't want their routine, their traditions, or their power challenged, even by the truth.
Right. When Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, instead of rejoicing, they got angry. They clung to their rules rather than the heart of God's mercy.
And don't we do that too sometimes? We say, Lord, don't ask me to give up this habit, or this comfort, or this routine.
Exactly. We want God's blessings without the discomfort of obedience. But Pastor Choi reminds us that when we say, "Don't ask me, Lord," we're really saying, "I'd rather stay in control."
To know God's will, we have to be willing to move out of our comfort zones, to let him stretch us and shape us through his word.
The second obstacle is refusing to acknowledge who Jesus really is. The religious leaders respected Moses, but rejected Jesus.
They called him uneducated, a deceiver, even demon-possessed. Their hearts were closed, and that blinded them from recognizing God's truth.
Pastor Choi said something so insightful, that our attitude toward Jesus determines our knowledge of God's will.
If we treat Jesus casually or only call on him when it's convenient, how can we expect to hear his voice clearly?
That's right. To know God's will, we must honor Christ daily, not just with our words, but by obeying his commands.
When we truly acknowledge Jesus as Lord, he reveals more of his will to us. The third obstacle is one that hits close to home: seeking our own glory instead of God's.
Yeah, the religious leaders loved recognition. They wanted people's praise, not God's approval.
Jesus saw right through that. He said, "He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true."
Pastor Choi illustrated this with that great story, the man hanging from a branch on a cliff who prays for God's help. God tells him, "Let go of the branch." But he refuses and cries out, "Is anyone else out there?"
Such a perfect picture of us sometimes. We ask for God's will, but when he reveals it, we resist it because it doesn't fit our plans.
To know God's will, we must seek his glory above our own comfort, pride, or ambition.
That brings us to Jesus' promise in John 7:17. If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know.
The late Father Archer Torrey once said, "Willingness to do God's will is the key to knowing God's will. If you are willing, you are 80% ready."
That's so true. God isn't looking for perfection, he's looking for a willing heart.
When we move out of our comfort zones, acknowledge Jesus as Lord, and seek God's glory above all else, his will becomes clear.
And sometimes it begins with a simple prayer like Jesus prayed in Gethsemane. Not as I will, but as you will.
So today, let's ask ourselves, am I truly willing to do God's will?
Let's surrender our comfort, our pride, and our own desires, and ask God to align our hearts with his.
Thank you for joining us today on Faith Talks.
And special thanks to Pastor Kyewoon Choi for this inspiring message from his series, How to Know God's Will.
Next time, we'll explore part 3, 5 ways to discern God's will. You won't want to miss it.
Until then, walk in faith, seek his glory, and trust that his will is always good.
See you next time on Faith Talks.
See you next time on Faith Talks.